Good evening, and we'll get started in just a moment. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. From the Boston Public Library, I'm Kristen Motti. Tonight, author Skip Finley will discuss his book, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. Skip will be joined in conversation by Dr. Priscilla Douglas, recently appointed chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the Boston Public Library. Lamerchi Frazier, Director of Education and Interpretation at the Museum of African American History, will moderate audience questions later in the program. Before Skip and Priscilla join us in just a few moments, a few small items of housekeeping, and also some brief welcomes from our partners in tonight's program. If you're in Zoom, your cameras and microphones are muted. If you're over on YouTube, you're watching the live stream. In Zoom, closed captioning can be turned on and off by the live transcript button on the corner of the bottom of your screen. Questions for Skip can be typed into the Q&A box also on the bottom of your screen or in the chat box over on YouTube. We'll get to as many questions as possible toward the end of the program. We've received several already and we'll accept them throughout the talk this evening. This program is being recorded and will be available on our websites in a couple of days. Signed copies of Whaling Captains of Color can be bought from our bookstore partner for tonight's talk, Frugal Bookstore. The information is in the chat and it's also on the screen. You can see where to buy that, and we'll put it in the chat again a little bit later. Also, you could check your local library as well. Links to resources and other information from our organizations will also be shared periodically throughout the conversation. Now, greetings from our partners for tonight's talk. Beth, over to you. Beth, I think you're muted.
I will start over. Thank you, Kristen. And hello, everyone. I'm Beth Carol Horrocks, the head of special collections at the State Library of Massachusetts. We're really glad to be here tonight for this virtual discussion of Skip Finley's work, since the topic in all aspects of it fits in so well with our own holdings. And we'll talk more about that later, but for now, we'll have a quick welcome from our collaborators at the Museum of African American History, and then our presentation. So, Lamerchi.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to represent the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. I am Lamerchi Frazier, Director of Education and Interpretation, and I bring you greetings from the board of the museum, the staff, the CEO and President Leon Wilson, and we want to say a great shout out to our favorite son of history of the whaling industry, Skip Finley, and we are so happy to be with him tonight and look forward to having you enjoy this program. And we also want to say we are grateful to participate with our collaborators.
Thank you, Lamerchi. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. Welcome to all of you connected to our organization through your family studies or your interest in America's cultural life and history. To the team at the Boston Public Library and my fellow partners tonight, thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you. We're delighted to be co-presenting tonight's historically rich and truly important program. Skip, we can't wait to hear from you. Kristen, back to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, partners. Thank you. Skip Finley's conversation partner this evening tonight is Dr. Priscilla Douglas. Priscilla Douglas is an executive coach, author, and speaker. Thousands of leaders in Fortune 500 companies have profited from her insights, her empathy, and her catalyzing energy to adapt to and transform the business landscape. When Governor Weld appointed her Secretary of Consumer Affairs, Priscilla made state history as the first Black woman to hold a cabinet position. You can often find her out on the high seas. She loves sailing, and her scuba diving trips have taken her to many places the whaling captains explored. Thank you, Priscilla, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you so much to our partners. I'm delighted to be here tonight. It's really an honor. And when I think about how to introduce Skip Finley, I came up with a quotation from German philosopher, author Schopenhauer. And he said, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit, but genius hits a target no one else can see." Well, Skip has always hit the target, and his first target was Karen, his wife. They celebrated 50 years of marriage on May 6th. A position at WGBH in Boston was bullseye for Skip Finley and began his career in media. He excelled in broadcasting, then as a columnist for the Gazette, and he always hits his mark as a mesmerizing storyteller. Now, if you ask Skip how to describe himself, he would say when he gets an idea, it captivates his attention, and he is like a dog with a bone. I am so proud to announce that last week, Skip was named the 2020 Author of the Year by the National Institute Press Whaling Captains for his book, Whaling Captains of Color. I mean, that's a big deal, the Naval Institute of Press. So I'm honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Skip Finley, who's going to tell us about his book, his career, and his work, and the impact on this story has had on the world.
You guys should all know, full disclosure, am I on? Yes. Priscilla and I went to college together. She was the smart one who graduated. I just went to meet all the girls, and she was one of the most fascinating people on campus. The day I met her on Huntington Avenue at Northeastern, she'd just gotten off of probably a Triumph Trident motorcycle, took her helmet off with the biggest afro you've ever seen in your life, walked across to the quadrangle of Northeast across Huntington Avenue, stopping trains and cars and trucks and guys like me. We've been buddies ever since. Thank you so much. Also, full disclosure, I have spoken for Lamerche over on Nantucket. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book and why I did it. I'm not going to talk too much about me, but I want to point out something, a small surprise to you, particularly at the library. Dr. Douglas pointed something out to me, about a week ago that I hadn't thought of, and it involves my book, so we're going to get to that. First, you guys, especially the Boston crew here, you're familiar with America's oldest warship, the Constitution. You're possibly less familiar with the Charles W. Morgan, which is the second oldest ship that America has owned. The Charles W. Morgan launched July 21st, 1841. 17 of its original crew of 30, its captain, and 7 of all of its captains were from Martha's Vineyard, where I live right now. The part about me is, after being a broadcaster, one day I decided I wanted to become a writer. Jane Seagrave, the publisher of the Vineyard Gazette, said, how'd you like to write the Oak Bluffs Town column? And I almost fell out. This was a column made famous since the 1960s by Harlem Renaissance writer Dorothy West, who was friends with my mom and who I knew. I mean, I was just so honored. So I did. For 5 years, I wrote that column and wanted to become a writer. When the Charles W. Morgan was fully restored in June 23rd, 2014, it was sailed up here to Martha's Vineyard. Priscilla was there, happened to be there that afternoon. I was there as my first experience with a whale ship. And it was also the first time anyone alive had ever seen a real whale ship, a sail. It prompted Martha's Vineyard Magazine's editor, Paul Schneider, to ask me, hey, how'd you like to write an article for the magazine about William A. Martin, the black whaling captain? All I heard, to be honest, was write an article for a magazine. One thing led to another. I started going to school and finding out how in the world could a black guy get to be captain of anything in the 1800s. It didn't take long for me to find out, first, that he wasn't the first one, nor was he the only one, and it turned out, there were several more. You can see my bookshelf over there. There's about the bottom 3 shelves, 2.5 or so columns over. I'm guilty. I have a very short attention span. I'm notably ADHD. I'm OCD. All I wanted to do for the rest of my life at that point in history was find out how in the hell this guy got to be a captain. So I went out and bought all those books. A couple months later, my wife, came in, and I'm also one of the least mature people you're likely to meet. So I'm not allowed to have money. I have an ATM card with a limit. I have an allowance monthly, and Karen pays all of our bills, amongst which she saw at that point, purchased probably 80 or 90 books about whaling, and she's okay, what's going on? I said, there's this guy named William A. Martin. He was the captain of a whaling ship, and he was black, and I'm finding out everything about him. So I read all those books. I think I'm up to about 160 some at this point. I also read, hundreds of master's theses, of abstracts, pretty much everything you can find on the internet, about this. And before I knew it, I was writing a book about, whaling captains of color. And I'm going to touch about some of those things, in particular the title. Anyway, the magazine printed, that story, the Charles W. Morgan, in its May-June 2014 issue. Included was my story, Ahab, Not Your Average Ahab, about William A. Martin. In the course of my study, I found out some amazing things. And I hope I'm not the only one to get too excited about it. But whaling was a business. There was 15,913 different whale trips. Each of them was a separate business enterprise. The business was produced by 2,700 ships that covered the world, literally marked, found, and diagrammed, mapped all the islands, all the atolls, everything around this entire world and all of the seas, of the planet. Of these 15,000 trips, they had about 2,500 captains. One of the more unique things about whaling was each trip lasted average 3 to 4 years, if you can imagine. Also, if you can imagine, the business model was pretty much find the whale, kill it, harvest it, melt it down to oil, return with its products, and get paid and make some money. Each of these business enterprises was marked by something unsavory. A list of them would include, it was the second most dangerous occupation after mining, boredom, cannibalism, inadequate clothing, desertion, disease, poor food, odors from hell, bad and inexperienced management, barbaric medical care, mutiny, parsimonious owners, poor pay, piracy, cramped quarters, vermin infestation, frightening weather, and at times whales are fought back. And we know that because probably the only book that we all know and love and didn't read was Moby Dick. Most of Moby Dick was true, but whaling was not about the personalities of either the whale or Captain Ahab. It was about the people aboard the ship who were tasked with bringing that business back that ultimately became what we recognize today as our private equity funds, or perhaps a hedge fund might be, a different way of describing it. The English author Samuel Johnson wrote, "A ship is worse than a jail. There is in a jail better air, better company, better convenience of every kind. For over 60% of the time whaling was an industry, Black people were legally enslaved and people of color marginalized." When I say the entire length of the industry, this is an industry that probably officially lasted from 1715 until 1928. Consider those years and what was happening, what was occurring in America over that time span. Several wars, all of which impacted whaling. Slavery, certainly. the breakup and reconstitution, not reconstruction of America, all happened in this time frame. So over this period of time, what we found out is about 175,000 people ever went whaling. Probably most of them, as many as 90% of these men only went once because it was such a tough business, it was so hard to do. Between 35 and 40, upwards of 40% of the people who ever went whaling were people of color, because really no one wanted to do it. In talking about the people of color, I had to make a decision in all this research, and part of it, I'm not going to belabor you with it. But I was a suit in the broadcasting business. I'm a deal guy. I do financial modeling, raise money, debt, equity, those type of things. So of course, the monetary punitive aspects of the business were of the most interest to me. Well, to find out that over this period of time, probably a 280-year period, this is a $10 billion industry in my numbers, not the rest of the leading experts in whaling. Technically, it's almost impossible to find out, what the true number for all that whaling was. But that's a good number to work with, $10 billion. So these men of color who participated weren't just Black. They were very, how do you describe Absalom Boston, whose great-granduncle, was a slave, whose father was Black, freed, and whose mom was Native American Wampanoag. The same was true of Paul Cuffey. On the other side, Michael Wainer, one of these captains, just the reverse. He identified as Native American, but he was also Black based upon his parentage, and so on down the line. So using Black was a construct that didn't make sense for the book, because there are people of color. The other one people often forget are the ones who are really responsible for half of whaling's value at the end of the industry, the Cape Verdean community. Mm-hmm. Well, we know Cabo de Verde is actually in Africa. We know those people are Africans. My friend, Al Vicente, good friend of mine, also a broadcaster, fished with him quite a bit. He's from an island like I'm from an island. Al Vicente can catch a fish in a bathtub. No matter where we were, Al would find a way to catch a fish when no one else was doing it. Al said something unique to me when I was talking, yes.
Skip, talk about the Quakers. What was the role of the Quakers and the Wampanoags, the Native Americans? Tell us a little bit more about that.
All right, huge role. I'm getting to that because I want to make this point in particular. It was the Quaker community, the Friends, if you will. They had made a decision early on that they were not going to be slaveholders. They were the biggest abolitionists. They founded Nantucket. They founded whaling on Nantucket, and then they moved it to New Bedford. They would rather have had Black people aboard their ships as free people working this industry than being a slave someplace else in the world. They were quite adept at it. And as the business grew and moved on, they were the ones who also, in a way, were responsible for freedom in America. One of the first recorded episodes was when Prince Boston who was a slave, who was let to a whale captain to go to work in that ship, and the money he made would be paid to his owner. He did such a good job that the captain says, no, I'm going to pay you, I'm not going to pay your owner. End of the day, there was legal, there was civil actions, there was lawsuits. Prince Boston was entitled to that money. He was paid that money. And as a direct result of that case in 1773, there was freedom from slavery on the island of Nantucket. We can look back now and, is there a track between, freedom being outlawed in the state of Massachusetts in 1783, over 100 years before the Civil War? Okay, so, just keeping that in context, there's a lot to juggle, if you will, all delivered to us by the Quakers who said, folks are folks, we should be equal, and we can make money if we do that. Well, along the way, an interesting thing happened. I don't want to give you a list of, the 50-some whaling captains that I found and identify them all. The Cape Verdeans and Native Americans. These are all men of color, but the white man had different words for a group of people of color, most of which were not as positive, for example, as we would like. What's kind of unusual, as it turns out, I didn't know this. Priscilla says, Skip, can you talk about the Liberator? So I'm like, wow. So I said, you know why? So, well, the Boston Public Library has the entire Liberator, and they do, and not only have the Liberator, but it's digitized and accessible. All right. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole and chase down what I know, but I wanted to highlight some things for you. There's a man named Edward Pompey on Nantucket, who was a whaling captain, who was friends with Absalom Boston, one of the earlier whale captains. They were both freemen. They're whale ship captains and owners. Pompey's only voyage was on the Rising States in 1836, but it was Black ship owner Richard Johnson who convinced him to accept the role as captain, with a crew that included Paul Cuffey's son, William. Think about the year 1836. Again, we're 40 years out, okay, from the end of the Civil War, and we've got 2 whaling captains and an owner of a whale ship. How astounding. That trip didn't cover its investment. But Pompey figured out it was more productive to own these ships than to operate them, as the captain, which he did. A problem in those days was Absalom Boston, and the rest of these folks could have been thrown into slavery at any time, thanks to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and another one in 1850, again, encompassing the bulk, of the productive years of whaling. Virginia actually adopted a law in 1804 that said that no more than a third of ships' crews could be Black, and none could have a Black captain. That would kind of discourage your whale trip from landing in Charleston, South Carolina to refuel for water, or food. Yet, Maryland required that all Black crews had to have a white pilot. South Carolina prohibited even free Black men from leaving ships when docked at its ports and under the threat of being sold as slaves. The atrocious practice reached extraordinary and absurd extremes. One example was when a Cape Verdean sailor, Manuel Pereira, who probably spoke little English, who was aboard a British ship that had put into Charleston because of a storm, and they arrested him and put him in jail because they thought he was Black, and he wasn't. Okay, so on and on. We could go on this thing, but merely stopping at a southern port in the years when whaling, was the 3rd largest industry in Massachusetts, the 5th largest business in America, a $10 billion industry. I've yet to find a single whale trip that left south of even Delaware. Okay, so how much did racism cut the nose off the face, of a productive industry like this? Richard Johnson, the man who would become an owner, tracing back his history, years earlier, he was known what was called supercargo. All right, I don't know what we would call that today, but a supercargo was a person who would buy the goods and products that the ship needed, to feed its crew, for example. They would keep charge of the paperwork. They would identify the cargo, how much was made, how much was stored, whatever. Anyway, even though he was not part of the ship's command, when the ship pulled in, into Charleston, 1824, the local people wanted to place all the Black men, including Johnson, and wouldn't put him in jail for the evening. The management of the ship, the captain, crew, an officer said, no, not this guy. We need that guy. He's staying aboard. They placed a bond for him. So you see this unique relationship that whalemen had, okay, with the laws of the land, and they all kind of, stuck together. I go deeper into that, but as luck would have it, Richard Johnson also owned a store that he bought from Paul Cuffey's family when he married Paul Cuffey's sister. So there's about a dozen of these guys in the early years, who were somewhat, nepotist, in that Paul Cuffey, the first Black whaling captain, wanted all of his ship's captains to be Black and many of their crews. They were very successful, over the years. Edward Pompey also owned a store as he got older and made his money from whaling over on Nantucket. One of the things he sold was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, and also thoughts, on African colonization. By the way, I took all these notes from my book, which I never put all this together, thanks to Pris saying, hey, Skip, what about The Liberator? Which I didn't know. Another one, Pompey was friends with Garrison, who was also friends with James Fortin, another person who was friends with Paul Cuffey, who had been captured aboard a whale ship by the British, like Paul Cuffey. who had financed the Liberator and to allow it to exist, you know, for it. Garrison wrote in a letter to Pompey, every colored man ought to own a copy, as the book contains the sentiments of his brethren in all parts of the country on the subject of colonization and fully exposes the wickedness of the American colonization society. Let me pause there and say for a second, the movie Hidden Figure, wonderful movie, aptly titled, but in many cases, in this case, no one has hidden the fact that there were Black whaling captains from us. It's just that no one wrote about it.
Right.
If we as people are going to create agency for the rest, of Black people, persons of color, we have to tell our own stories. We have to write these stories so people can be proud of that. Okay. Garrison was the first really to do that, as he said, contains the sentiments of his brethren in all parts of the country. No one knew that I felt equally as bad about being a slave in Virginia or South Carolina, okay, until this came along. Until we write these stories, okay, we're not going to do that. In writing these stories, we can have pride in the fact, look, I saw roots. I'm tired of that. I don't want to be a slave. There's no fun. There's nothing about slavery anybody's going to find that was, that was popular, that was useful, that was fun, no matter what kind of racist redneck you are. All right, that's just, kind of common sense. But when 388,000 people were brought to America from other lands across the water, and 3.9 million of those Black people were free, becoming slaves, over those years, we were grown just like we were fruit to satisfy the commercial needs, of this country. But suppose there's more.
From 1619 until the
90, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Along the way, there are people. Skip Finley wrote a book. Skip Finley was a broadcaster. Dr. Priscilla Douglas. Okay, all over the country. Not just ball players, but people who contributed to society in so many ways. Was that what it took for a poorly slave to be proud enough in himself and his people to know that this too will pass and I can get to the next step? Okay.
One of the things, Skip, that you write about is that these Black and people of color captains, they were free on the high seas, but then when they hit land, they faced discrimination. So for example, their kids couldn't even go to schools, right? So right. What did they do? So they were mainly advocates. They built schools. Talk about that as well.
Edward Pompey and Absalom Boston built the first school for Black people on Nantucket. Paul Cuffey in Westport may have built the first integrated school that the world has ever seen. Okay, these are whaling captains. These were captains, thanks to freedom, were allowed to pursue their profession, to get better at their profession. And let me digress for a second and talk about the word meritocracy. How they get to be captains? Well, after being on the ship for 3 to 4 years and something happens to the captain, how are we going to get home? Well, 90% of the people who went whaling only went one time. The Native American, the Black, the people of color, they didn't have as many opportunities. They went over and over and over again. It didn't take but 3 or 4, different trips on a whale trip that only had 2 technological improvements in its entire close to 300-year history. Okay, so when something happened to the captain, folks looked around and that guy has been doing this for 11 times. 10 whale trips is 30 years worth of experience. 3 whale trips is 9 years worth of experience. We don't care who's the captain. If you can get us home and you can get us to oil, and we can make that money when we get there. So that's how these people were selected as replacement captains for the most part. And about half of these 50 guys replaced someone who had fallen sick or died or whatever. Back to school, particularly in Nantucket and Westport. Again, the time frame. Paul Cuffey didn't die until 1817. All right. Pompey didn't die until like 1836. They were accomplishing all of this, no help, from anyone, solely by dint of their being free, capable, and accomplished in a chosen field. Back over to Nantucket. Pompey got to be friends with William Garrison. He sold, his newspaper over there. And Garrison, of course, went to Nantucket and spoke there, along with Frederick Douglass. And strangely enough, all these folks, knew each other. They were all acquaintances. They were solving the problems of the world, if you will, thanks to their professions, providing them a reasonable amount of resources, money, if you will, so they could, so they could use their freedom and share that with their brethren, if you will. When Garrison went to Nantucket in 1842, Pompey was president of the Nantucket Colored Temperance Society and attended the New England Anti-Slavery Convention in 1834. When he died, his estate included the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, the narrative of William Wells Brown, born into slavery, been active in the cause of abolition since 1836, and was hired in 1847 as the Anti-Slavery Society lecture person. On August 10th, 1842, when the Anti-Slavery Society returned to Nantucket, it featured speeches by Garrison denouncing the U.S. Constitution as an agreement with hell, and by the fiery abolitionist Stephen S. Foster, who ignited a riot on Nantucket, right, when he delivered his Brotherhood of Thieves address. Yes, that's the base of the name of the restaurant, Nantucket Brotherhood of Thieves, by the way. Yes, I've eaten there. The food's fabulous, and it's a very cool place. Slavery, he claimed, consisted of 5 distinct crimes: theft or the stealing of a man's labor, adultery, the disregard of the requisitions of marriage involved in holding women as stock and prostituting them, man-stealing or kidnapping, piracy, the illegal taking of slaves from the coast of Africa, and murder, the firm intention of owners who could only hold slaves by the threat of termination. So Johnson was also no dilettante, when it came to his people. And again, the chain of, you're provided with an opportunity, you succeeded, you excelled, you were able to give back, and you did. All right. Yeah. But the time frame that we're discussing is so long ago, it's almost frightening because you don't read about this in our history books anywhere. Okay. Yeah, now you can read it literally at the Boston Public Library. You can see these words written 50, 80, 100 years before the Civil War about the freedom many of us enjoy today. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I didn't know that Frederick Douglass had been beaten in a Baltimore shipyard. And I bring that up because, of course, we think about George Floyd today. And before he came up with that treatise that you just talked about, I guess 50 people stood around while he was being beaten.
And cheered. All right. He was on the dock in Maryland. He worked in the sea business. He was a caulker at the time. Looked crosswise to someone, and these guys, beat him half to death, and other people just cheered. The difference today with Floyd, I'm not the most mature person. I don't have a lot of empathy, in all candor, but no one had to say the whole world was watching when folks watched that 9 minutes. What was the impact of that 9? No one was cheering. Okay, probably 98% of police officers in this country, felt the same way I did. Horrified, embarrassed, ashamed. Okay, the 2%, they're always going to be there. The 2% that do it, always. We're never going to get rid of them. We may outlaw racism, but we're always going to have racists. If you will.
But he was able to, the Siemens papers is, to talk a little bit about that before we go to Q&A.
The way,
in terms of,
the way Frederick Douglass was able to escape slavery, again, was thanks to whaling, okay, to protect our seamen in the War of 1776, the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812, when the British had this nasty habit of impressing our sailors, our seamen, okay. The government came up with the Seamen's Protection Papers in the mid-1700s that described you, where you were from, who you were, what your name was, what ship you worked for. And that fundamentally worked as if it were a passport. So provide you with a little bit of legitimacy. Well, former slaves who had been whalemen would let others in slavery use these papers, okay, and allow them to escape. Frederick Douglass used the Seamen's Protection Papers from one of his friends and found his way to New Bedford, where he became a caulker, on the dock. So again, there's whaling, okay? Frederick Douglass, one of the most effective speakers and writers of his time, made his way to Nantucket, okay? And we can find a way to connect all these men and this business and this industry of whaling to the end of slavery. For a strictly financial reason, ironically enough, it's the same reason we were slaves in the first place. But let's go and catch whales instead of doing that. In every presentation, I like to say, I don't want to be, kind of pigeonholed. In this story has the happiest of endings because the whales won. In this story today, there's substantially more money being made in watching whales instead of killing them. And the story of the whales is one, that's heartening and disheartening at the same time. You're talking about the largest creatures that have ever been on the earth. They have families. We know they have a language. They may have a religion, okay? There have been harpoons taken from whales that had died that have been tested to find that this one whale in particular lived over 235 years. So in theory, there may be whales swimming around longer than America has been a country since 1776. So the whales got to win, and yet the way we approach things, we didn't know the whale wasn't a fish until a law case in 1813. Think about that. Yeah, for 100 years we killed them, didn't know what they were.
Right. Killed me. Well, I'm going to, Skip, this is great. It's not ended. I'm going to hand you off to Lamerchi, and because there are tons of questions that have already been that are waiting for you. So thank you so much, Skip.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla. Both Skip and Priscilla are friends of the Museum of African American History, and we are so proud to present you with our partners today. So that was a lovely break of summary to enlighten us and to help us to embrace your book that must be so chock full of things that we need to know. I think that your presentation, Skip, was so vibrant and liberating for many of us who feel like we're caught today in a space where we're ignorant of things that we should know and should have known long ago. But we really are grateful for your scholarship and for your research in this area. I would like to say that in line with what you have said, we want to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Massachusetts nation, and that we want to be their good guests. And with that, I want to ask of the questions that we have received from the audience, which are many, and we thank our precious audience for this, is a question about Native Americans who were mariners. What do we learn from them with respect to whaling? I know that they were very instrumental in whaling in Nantucket and in this area. What do you have to say about what they taught us?
All right. The first interesting point is one of the more insidious things I found out, was the white man encouraging Native Americans and Black people to marry so their progeny would be free. Now, if you think this occurred roughly 1740, it was illegal to teach Black people how to read. Probably that was true with Native Americans already, but that was such a hoax because first, it wasn't true. What it was a way that, if the Native American and Black person, had a child, all that child was no longer a Native American and couldn't participate in everything the tribe participated in, whatever payments or resources, But Native American Whalemen, which is the title of a book written by Dr. Nancy Shoemaker, who was extraordinarily helpful to me in my research. There were also several of them undiscussed, unwritten about, people didn't know. We all know the famous people, Tashtigo and the names, from Moby Dick. Some of us may know the name of Amos Smalley, who actually in real life, when he was aboard the Platina in 1904, actually killed a white whale. Amazingly enough, coincidentally enough, Amos Smalley is related to many of the people here on Martha's Vineyard of the tribe, where I live, the tribe up in Aquinnah. His great grandson, Buddy Vanderhoop, who's a charter captain, actually has a tooth from that sperm whale's mouth, which is describes about a 70-footer. That's a very, very big whale.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a huge article in Reader's Digest about Amos Smalley, having done that. And it doesn't really describe him as an African American or a Native American anywhere. He identified as Native American, and that's the factor that I use as, that self-identification. I don't want to be the one to say, here's what you are, I'd be just like, everyone else. Coincidentally, though, a man went on a whaling ship named Clifford Avery. He's the one who did the cover of who painted the picture in the cover of my book. He was on the another whale trip with Amos Smalley, who's pictured on the cover of my book throwing that harpoon.
All right. Well, I really appreciate that answer because these stories are the ones that we need to hear to enliven the history. As a historian, I know that delivering the history is somewhat difficult because people think that history is boring, but you certainly make it vibrant and illuminate these stories in ways that make it accessible. So thank you for that. But I'd like to know from you, as you got involved in this, what was the impetus for you to really delve into who these ship captains were? Were they owners of the ships? I'm combining some of the audience questions here. Were they owners of the ships as well as captains? And in the case where there was a Black whaling captain, what was the relationship between all the men on those ships and that captain?
All right. I'm going to answer the last part of that question first because that's key. Remember, these trips last 3 to 4 years. Okay. For 3 to 4 years, you're on a whaling ship, and a better description would be 2 average American homes put together. That's the space you have for 3 to 4 years. You're sharing that space with 36 people. If you're on the lower ranked crewman, which is 30 of the 36 people, your assigned space for that period of time is the space of a backseat or an SUV. You learn to get along. There was only discipline aboard whale ships. There was no fighting, there was no arguing, and the captain was omniscient and could take literally corporal action. Okay? It wasn't until 1850 that flogging was no longer allowed aboard a whale ship. Okay, it continued well past that because again, captain's omniscient, captain was God. But a Black captain could flog a white man aboard a whale ship who in Delaware, South Carolina, and Charleston, for example, he wasn't legally allowed to look in the eye.
Wow. Okay, so in line with that, Captain Robert Smalls in South Carolina, after that takeover of a vessel from the Confederate Army in the Civil War, turns that ship with the Black engineers over to the Onward, which was a Union vessel in that war. They mutinied. One of our audience members asked this question: Skip, in your research, did you find any reference to whaling ships that mutinied and were turned over to those who were enslaved? And he says that he or she says, I have found reference to this for a couple of whaling ships in the 1850s, and wonder how widespread and how also this worked for many crew members who were also Cape Verdean, African, etc. There's a lot in that question to unpack, but I think it is worthy.
I understand. One thing, because I presume, unless you read the book, this is all new to everyone. I get that.
Yes.
The difference between a whale ship and a merchant ship were complete night and day different. Aboard a merchant ship, you're going from place to place. On a naval ship, you're going to place, then you're coming back. Okay, so the racism that existed in America existed aboard that ship. Yes. That was not true aboard a whale ship. Okay. A lot of these things, are mischaracterized. Here's one. Here's the biggest one. Moby Dick. Wow, the white whale. Only 7 whales have attacked a whale ship ever. In 280 years, 15,900 whale ships.
Wow.
There have only been 41 mutinies aboard a whale ship in 280 trips. Okay, you follow? Yes. All of those mutinies ended badly. No, there was none. Never was a ship turned over, from the whale whaling management team to the crew. And the one or two times that was true, it was taken back.
Okay.
You have to separate, those issues. I love the story of Robert Small. I can't believe that hadn't been a movie yet. But I didn't spend as much time there because he wasn't a whaler,
Yes.
You could do an outline of the Amistad, and kind of sort of tell that story. Most pure historians would tell you the story didn't come down like we want to believe it today.
Yes. Okay. Well, you also, with your conversation with Priscilla, talked about Frederick Douglass and his seaman's paper, and the fact that his wife made his sailor's uniform to help that escape be successful brings up the point, I think, of the question of the role of women. What is the role of women that you found in whaling?
Good question. First of all, let's all step back, take a deep breath. Remember, this is the Victorian era. The entire time of whaling was a Victorian era. And there was no such thing as suffragettes. Women were not treated like humans like we are today. Women, were maybe a little bit past chattel-like slaves, but that's the way it was. I don't address that other than, the stories which are fascinating. Before, if you have an interest, you should read Captain Ahab Had a Wife by Lisa Norling. Lisa Norling and Margaret, what's her name? Wrote another, Iron Ships, Wooden Women. But the stories that fascinate me are the one where one of my captains, Valentine Rosa, was first made aboard a whale trip. And the captain's wife was aboard as a navigator. She taught this black man, this Cape Verdean, how to become a navigator, which allowed him to become captain. Fast forward years later, Valentine Rosa is aboard the Canton II with his wife and 5-year-old child, and she was a navigator, of that trip.
Wow.
So the connection can't be why were women mistreated, because it is what it was. The question's got to be is how can we use whaling and how can we use navigation to teach women STEM?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. There were many questions about African Americans in the maritime trades coming from Rhode Island, Maine, Martha's Vineyard, Oaks Bluff, Jamaica. Is there anything in your research that kind of gives us an idea of the geography that is covered and mapped by this participation in whaling?
There's actually a list in the book of the 75 major ports that probably provide 95% of all whaling. They are all exclusively in the Northeast. The overwhelming majority of them, Sag Harbor, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and New Bedford, a ballpark at 85% of the whaling industry over that entire close to 300-year period.
Wow. Okay. And so one of the important questions, and there were many about descendancy, is that have you met any descendants of the whalers that you've done the stories of?
In fact, I've met about half a dozen. The most astounding of which is a woman who is probably literally the last living immediate descendant of a whaling captain. She lives in Mashpee, on the South Coast.
Oh, that's exciting.
Her father was a whaling captain. Her father may have been the last living whaling captain, having died in 1989. I've got 7 or 8 minute video of him, sepia black and white video of him when he's in his 80s talking about being a whaler.
Oh my! So this is something that you're keeping up with and continuing to research as you go.
Very much so. Let me interject. And one important thing, obviously, well, I think my dad was a whaler or my ancestor, my great, whomever. There is now a website that has been developed by the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the Mystic Seaport Museum called whalinghistory.org, where you can literally type in a person's name and find out if he was on the ship, which ship he was on, and when he served.
Okay. Well, we know that Crispus Addicts, the first to die in the Revolution that we know of, had a mother who was Wampanoag and lived in Nantucket, and he ran away in 1750 before the Boston Massacre, 20 years before the Boston Massacre, and he was he was on the sea.
We believe he was a whaler.
He was a whaler.
We believe he was a whaler.
When we look at that history and arc it all the way to that descendant, there's some real excitement I have as a historian about making the case for what freedom on the sea was like, as you have pointed out to us. And as I was witness to your lecture in Nantucket, as you were processing this book, as you began to make it be published. And exciting is now hearing you as you speak about this and the light in your face, and the confidence with which you're delivering this, that is making me want more. And I am just going to encourage our audience at this time to please buy the book. That's the whole point of this, is
buy at least 6
buy the book.
Buy 6.
Yeah, absolutely. But we do want to, before you go, understand more about what you are looking at with respect to places that you've lived, like Oak Bluffs, what it makes you feel like as one who has investigated this history in whaling and the heritage, the legacy. Could you speak on that, how you feel about this?
Okay, again, I remember when I first became a general manager of a radio station, we used to have to do editorials when there's such a thing as a freedom doctrine. And I did the math once. I said, every time I state my opinion, I'm valuing it, as equal to that of 26,000 of my listeners. So that, that's not really fair. I'm not that good. I'm not that smart. So I don't like to step too far over that line. Even now, I didn't get paid to do this. This is just something that this is simple curiosity. Why I did this and to find this information. Am I still excited and delighted about it? Absolutely. I find new stuff every day. We found another black whaling captain who sailed from Connecticut, from New London, just recently. In one of these Zooms, post says, "Have you ever heard the name?" And no, I hadn't heard the name. Now I've got amazing resources, thanks to all the museums that I've worked with. And I can find that name, and sure enough, he was both a sealer and a whaling captain. Now it's my job to find out his story. That's the hard part. Yeah. There were no pictures before 1840, whenever photography, began to blossom. The business is more than half over.
Yes.
There's not a lot of information, so.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, Valentine Rosa, one of the wives, teaching a Cape Verdean to be a captain. Can you tell us more about the Cape Verdean participation in whaling, that magnificent seamen?
To say the least. All right, well, the first issue, I also have, a bunch of buddies who are Cape Verdean. Here on the island where I grew up, of course, over in New Bedford. I sat with a couple, I'm not going to give the name, but I sat with a couple of historical experts, leaders of the Cape Verdean community, and my issue was, how you all like to be called? That's a story. Growing up, we were teenagers. We were 12, 11, 13 years old, and one of my buddies here on the island is Cape Verde. We were at the beach one day, and somehow came out of it. Oh no, I'm not black. I'm white. I'm like, dude, I got a tan. You're way darker than I am. What are you talking about? And I think that was my first experience with Cabo de Verde, which is the name of their country. Cape Verdeans have a different language, they eat different food, their religion is somewhat different than ours. Yes, though, they are a part of Africa. They're 300 miles offshore of Western Africa. Their country may be perhaps the most polyglot country in the entire world, because that is a perfect place for shipping of all types to stop and get food, fruit, vegetable, water. Okay. Along the way, over the years, though, the Cabo de Verde archipelago, if you will, is 9 or 10 islands. Several times over the years, these islands had droughts. There was no water. And at one point, at 3 different times, 12,000, 20, 25,000 people died. So the whale ships would come from America. They would stop there. They would pick up their supplies. The people who wanted to get off the boat as quickly as possible would desert. Whaling had about a 40% desertion rate. And they would hire the new folks from Cabo de Verde who loved to get on that boat and pursue their island habits of fishing and become whalers over the years. As whaling ended, late 1800s. It was the Cape Verdean community that bought these whale ships that were going out of business for dimes on a dollar, so they could turn them into packet ships, and they would take those ships over to Cabo de Verde and bring their people back and take food and products over to them. Cabo de Verde, Cape Verdeans completed the whaling industry in America.
All right, thank you for that. And there's one more question that we are allowed to ask because time is on us, but can you explain the term meritocracy that's in the title of your book?
Great question, and I can. No one cared who these men who became captains were. They didn't care about your background. We don't care if you can read. We don't care if you're a nice person. We want to know that you can navigate, you can find a whale, you can kill a whale, and you get us home. Period. Such is the nature of meritocracy. I often tease people in some of these Zooms. I said the next time we had a meritocracy, they called it the NBA. I mean that humorously now. But nobody cares, who you are. If you're, 6 feet 9 inches tall and can shoot and dribble. It's the same in whaling. Unfortunately, there are few industries like that. Equally as unfortunate, though, there was no path to the future for these people. Okay, when your best skill after all this experience that you had was, surely, the willingness to get aboard a whale ship and to be heroic, it's not transferable to your kids.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which is why we don't see, there's one home, the William T. Shorey House in Oakland, California, small house. He was an amazing whaling captain. He may be the number 1 and number 2 in terms of number of trips and how many whales that he was able to harvest. But he died as a policeman on the docks in San Francisco. Yet his home is the only one that's on the National Historic Register that still remains.
Wow.
William A. Martin's home is still on the island of Chappaquiddick. It's owned privately, but it's fallen in disrepair over the years. It was an applicant at one point for the National Historic Register. Now folks are not going to get on a line to wait to get on a 3-car ferry to go to Chappaquiddick from Martha's Vineyard and Egertown to see that house.
Yeah.
Hopefully someone will move that house and reconstruct it. That's a lot of money and a lot of effort, but that's the legacy. Paul Cuffey, the first American Black millionaire, owned 160 acres, okay, that the family still owns in some, passion, south of Dartmouth, over in south of New Bedford. But that's about it. That's about all we have left.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Skip Finley, for your wonderful presentation tonight to help open the door and that portal for us to see these whaling captains in live living color. It has been a very, very opening and wide conversation about the subjects and the threads of your research into the whaling captains. So on behalf of all of our collaborators, and we'd like to thank Priscilla Douglas also for her lead in this conversation. Bless her, and thank you for what you have shared with us. I want to also thank the audience for their brilliant questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but that's why we need to read the book. We need to get the book and read the book. And Skip says by 6. So we'll keep to that. And just for all of that we do, we are so enlarged by these kinds of conversations and the wonderful scholars that you, as Skip, have like Skip, who have come to us on this virtual space that we can share. So thank you very much, Skip. I do want to say that on behalf of the Museum of African American History, we'd like to invite the audience to 2 of our upcoming events. The first one that I want you to know is you can have a Memorial Day treat as a witness to history. The unveiling of the 54th Regiment Memorial will happen from May 28th to May 31st, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. It is an unveiling of the Shaw 54th Memorial, Friday through Monday. You can review and view its restoration that has been a collaboration of the City of Boston, the Friends of the Public Garden, the National Park Service, and the Museum of African American History. Come on down and be a witness in Boston Common to one of the greatest treasures in American history of this monument. It is a living memorial to the 54th Regiment. We'd also like you to tune in to a conversation that we will have on June 16th with the Boston mayors. The conversation with those candidates on June 16th at 6 o'clock. Tune in and check it out at www.maah.org. Remember that the Museum of African American History is your museum. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to our next partner.
Hi, Skip. Thank you very much for your book and your presentation. I did read the entire book cover to cover, and while I thought I knew a lot about whaling, I learned to think about whaling in whole new ways, and that's always a good thing. I was also really glad to see how useful library collections were to you in your research. So it gives us hope when we see a great book come out of library collections. So I hope that you will all feel welcome to visit the State Library in the Massachusetts State House after we reopen. We have wonderful collections, wonderful resources, great staff, and while we're working from home, we'll be happy to help you with your research questions. And then once we reopen and you can come in to visit us, you'll be able to get even better help with your research. So I hope you'll keep an eye on our website, mass.gov/LIB, and come visit us as soon as you can. So you'll see from the slide, can we go back to the slide, the first slide? Thank you. That our collections cover a wide variety of formats and subjects, though most of them relate to Massachusetts history and government. We've put a lot of links in the chat that talk about our collections, and especially the ones that are related to tonight's presentation, including a link to our exhibit on the whaling, fishing, and shellfish industry in Massachusetts called Exercise in Fishing. And it's a fun exhibit. I hope you all have a look at it. So let's see, just very briefly, we have 2 more author talks coming up in the very near future, namely next week on June 2nd, in partnership with the Boston Public Library and Museum of African American History and the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts. Will present Dr. Jarvis R. Givens on his new book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching. And then on Thursday, June 3rd, in collaboration with American Ancestors, NEHGS, we'll have Joseph Bagley and his new book, Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. So I hope you will all be able to join us on both of these occasions. And I thank you. Margaret.
Thank you, Beth. We at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society are delighted to have been part of this evening. Skip, your passion for your research is positively contagious. And we're all fired up. So we encourage all of you out there to stay in touch with us, also with the State Library, learn more about us, and let us help you if you're doing historical research about your family or someone else's or about a time period. Our library stacks on Newbury Street will reopen in June, or anytime you can visit our digital archives, connect with our genealogists, or join in our educational programs online at americanancestors.org. There you'll find lots of helpful videos, educational programs, including a couple really aptly titled for tonight. One of them, Researching Mariner Ancestors in New England. Another offering guidance on researching is Black Families in Revolutionary Era Plymouth, Massachusetts. We offer many free subject guides on our website, including one on African American genealogy. And in a program on June 10, we're going to focus on researching the Deep South. So links for those resources are being placed in the chat, but there is so much more. So do look at those links and do also look on our website, AmericanAncestors.org, for more. Our goal is to encourage people to understand their backgrounds. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and connect. And my vein is mostly literary, my area of expertise. And so I do want to mention 3 upcoming virtual author talks. Beth already spoke to you about Joseph M. Bagley's book, The City Archaeologist of Boston, looking at historic buildings with our NEHGS curator, Kurt DiCamillo. That's June 3rd. On June 15th, we're going to be hearing from journalist Gabrielle Glazer about her book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. She'll be joined by Peter O'Dowd, host of the WBUR program Here and Now. And on June 28th, we're welcoming the best-loved Canadian historian, Stephen Bone, with his history of Canada and the Hudson's Bay Company. He'll be in dialogue with Jeff Breithaupt, the Canadian-born singer-songwriter and podcaster now living in New York City. With them, we're going to hear about Canada's history, and we're going to celebrate Canada Day a few days early. So we hope you'll join the fun with some education on the side. Thank you for this evening. Thank you to everyone. Kristen, back to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much, Skip, for sharing your work with us. Priscilla, Lamerci, this was a fabulous evening. A reminder to you joining us, thank you for joining us. If you do want a copy of Whaling Captains of Color, we do have limited signed copies. The link is in the chat to get a copy from our bookstore partner, Frugal Bookstore. For upcoming talks like this one, as well as programs for all ages from the Boston Public Library resources, services, please visit us at Boston Public Library. And on the screen right now are a few of our upcoming author talks. We thank our partners, we thank our production team behind the scenes, and we thank you very much for joining us tonight. Take care, be well. And